Still got a call. Apologies for that. But thank you all for coming. What questions do people have? Or how about this? I can take questions from you all, or I got some students who emailed in some questions. You want me to start with these? Okay. Okay. So first question that came in, make sure that this is working. All right. Why do unique environments seem to have a stronger impact on personality than shared environments? So this is, I believe, coming in from our behavioral genetics, right? Where we're going through, we talked about our behavioral genetics piece of things, and then talking about personality and temperament, right? If we're looking at this, we're seeing that about 40 to 60% of personality temperament being attributable to genetic factors, and then this unique environment sort of kind of making up the rest. Short answer is don't worry too much about this. Like, I'm not going to sort of get into the weeds on what's going through on this because we didn't go through and spend time talking about it, right? But if we think about the types of things that make you in terms of your personality, and we'll talk about personality and how we think about that as a construct. But sort of your extent to which you are open to different experiences, right? The extent to which you are kind of anxious and nervous or sort of like have a tendency towards negative emotions, the extent to which you're comfortable sort of going out and sort of being extroverted and things along those lines. About half of that is temperament, right? And the rest of it is just going to be some of your own kind of unique personal experiences that kind of make up the rest of that, right? So if you come from sort of kind of a family sort of way, everybody's, you know, pretty kind of maybe, you know, kind of traditional, or I'm just thinking about something like my own sort of family. And sort of I grew up in Wyoming, right? So my own community, kind of pretty conventional, sort of kind of traditional kind of stuff going on like that. But sort of let's say you're out here at university, things along those lines, you're exposed to sort of different ideas and different people. So you always just get excited about going different places. You might be more open to experience, right? Like I would probably not take my dad to a sushi restaurant because he's probably not going to be excited about that. I like it, would be very good, but it's sort of one of those things that's part of my unique experience going through and sort of playing into sort of openness, conscientiousness, things along those lines. So great question, not something you need to necessarily worry about for the quiz, but just kind of thinking about what's underlying some of this stuff. Any questions about that or how we're thinking about some of these influences? Yeah. And remember that when we're talking about heritability, we're talking about to what extent do genetics account for just general differences we're seeing across groups, right? Not for this person, but as we look at differences in, let's say, extroversion across people, how much of the differences that we see, how much of that can we tie back to genetic influences? That's what we're talking about in terms of heritability types of things. Okay. Number two, could you explain how if motor development is constrained by biological maturation, how cultural practices influence speed the process up? Okay. So this is going to infancy development. So this slide here. So a little bit of confusion in the question. So the question being, how do cultural practices influence, speed up the process of physical maturation, which makes sense as a reasonable question if we're saying it's constrained by biology. Like how could like cultural factors go through and influence the speed at which people are going through and doing stuff? I would say here what we're saying is that environment can impact it, not necessarily cultural things. So I don't know that they're, to my knowledge, that sort of kids in India are walking faster than kids in the United States, right? When I'm talking about environment here with this, it's not a cultural thing that's going through. We're just talking about access to like adaptive activities for young kids. Okay, so when we're thinking about as children develop through these stages of physical development, right? So first, again, and sort of people here sort of work or sort of been around like small babies, younger brothers and sisters, cousins, things along those lines, littles, right? You see sort of starting to roll around, and so they're getting that, and they kind of start to sit up and kind of do that on their own, and maybe they start to crawl and sort of walk, right? If you're working with a 2 month old, right, they're not going to start crawling around because they can't. They're just not physically developed. They don't have the structure, the muscle tone, and things like that. And then neurologically, right, some of the things that sort of help us keep balance and upright, some of those things are still kind of developing, so they don't actually have the wiring to do that. So it doesn't matter how much you work with your kid at 2 months, they're not going to walk because they can't, right? So biology is and maturation effects are constraining that. But what we also see is an environment playing a role here, not culture necessarily, but do you have sort of toys around for that child to go through and grasp and pull? Are there places safely where they can grab and sort of pull themselves up, right? Are they being interacted with? Sort of, are they being held and things along those lines? If a child doesn't have that, these physical things will be massively delayed, right? If you just like let a kid like hang out in a playpen and never go through and approach it or interact with it, doesn't matter if you're feeding it, watering it, whatever, it's not going to sort of develop, right? So this is where we see within those Romanian orphanages, it wasn't anything about Romanian culture. It was the fact that you had kids who were not sort of receiving physical contact and activities to engage with their environment. And so what you said is, kids who were sort of maybe two who are sort of not able to like walk or things like that, right? I don't know the exact details. I'd have to go through and take a look, but this is the type of thing that we're seeing. Okay, so thinking about not only sort of what's going on in your body, sort of constraining types of things you can do, but also thinking the environmental factors being really important. This is why such a heavy influence in child development. It's important to interact with kids. It's important to play with kids. It's important for them to go and have things to do. This is why it's great. Like kids go run around, play outside, do stuff like be safe, like watch them so they're not falling off of stuff, but having opportunities to go through and interact, navigate with their environment, things along those lines, and that will sort of make sure that things are developing at a pace. Okay. Does that make some sense? Okay. What exactly happens in the brain during synaptic pruning? Okay. And this is again kind of coming up to this synaptic pruning thing. I actually don't. I'm not a physiologist, so I'm not exactly sure the specific details at the neurological level of what's going on. All you need to worry about is sort of knowing that as we go through and develop, even right now, so what people sort of early 20s here for the most part ish, 19, okay, right? Right now, we would go through and say, so you are all within emerging adulthood, right? And this starts to get really interesting in terms of where we go through. Some people in the developmental world don't count adulthood until like 22, 23 is when people are adults. Some of this is sociological types of things. Like certainly if we're looking talking about like the 1850s, people are sort of progressing into adult stuff much more quickly than they are today, right? But thinking about it at the biological level, where you're all at right now, still continuing development, primarily in the frontal lobes. Those are kind of the last thing to kind of finish baking 100%, right? So what we're seeing, particularly in sort of childhood and adolescence, remember that when we're born, our brain has a lot of connections, but those connections are incredibly efficient, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to be born, let's have everything connected to everything. And then the stuff that you're using a whole lot, the stuff that starts to become important, that strengthens, right? And the stuff that you're not using starts to sort of fade out. That's what we're talking about with synaptic pruning, and that's what's going on here, right? So as those language skills, those motor skills, and so those cognitive types of things, those circuits that are firing to help you do all the amazing things that you can do, those are starting to strengthen. The other stuff kind of fades out. The exact physiological mechanism, it's kind of a use it or lose it type of principle. I don't know exactly what those are. That's fine. If I don't know, I'm not gonna ask you about it, so don't worry about it. If you're interested in it, then sort of go through and take a look in their classes, they'll probably go through and touch on that, but for our purposes, you don't have to worry about it too much. Okay. Feel comfortable with that? All right. Okay, could you provide some more examples of how cultural influences might affect the timing of identity development during adolescence? Back to adolescent side. Okay, so again, I think here, a little bit of sort of crossing things in terms of thinking about cultural influences on the development of socialization practices, identity, and things like that. I wouldn't say that, at least to my knowledge, sort of cultural influences impacting the timing of identity development. So it's not like how quickly you sort of identify you as you, right? But more so thinking about the cultural influences on sort of the way we sort of approach the world, the way we approach relationships, the way we approach ourselves, situations, expression, and things along those lines, right? One of the things that we can talk about, and I'm sure that you don't have to worry about this, but if thinking about in terms of broad-based stuff, thinking about collectivist cultures and individualistic cultures, right? Individualistic cultures, like largely sort of identified as Western cultures, U.S., Western Europe, things along those lines, right? Where so the orientation of the individual tends to be through you as the unique person who's kind of forging your own way, and sort of my identity is formulated around myself and what makes me sort of a unique person, right? Versus collectivist cultures seeing an orientation of sort of view of self as a member of a larger whole, right? Like I am part of sort of my family, my society, things along those lines, right? So what we start to see is a less focus on what I want right now versus sort of what is my role in sort of developing my community and sort of identifying myself not just through sort of what I like and want, but through sort of my sort of family, things along those lines, right? And so not so much about the speed of timing, but just the way we go through and think about ourselves in the world and how we think about relationships, other people, things that we value, sort of those types of issues, hugely impacted by culture, right? But not necessarily the timing or sort of like how quickly or good you develop it, right? It's just sort of different sort of perspectives of things. Then last, a good question. Can reasoning be taught or does it have to be learned, right? Which is sort of kind of it's sort of like sort of this idea, this is kind of a nature nurture question about morality stuff like that. That's an awesome question. I don't know, right? And this starts to get into like some stuff when we get into when we talk about like personality and Freud and things along those lines, thinking about like questions about basic human nature, right? And if you talk to humanists, probably going to get a different response than if you were to talk to someone who's more psychoanalytic in terms of their orientation, sort of understanding sort of how people work, you know, in terms of sort of decisions of right or wrong, sort of ethical judgment, things like that. I think like anything else, it's probably sort of a combination of we're kind of wired, sort of probably goods to not just run around and murder one another. That wouldn't be useful from an evolutionary standpoint, but there's certainly quite a bit that's going to be sort of learned and acquired based on socialization, based on culture, sort of individual factors, environmental factors, and things along those lines, right? Do kids necessarily like grow up absent of any other information, start to sort of develop sort of like complex ideas of right or wrong, things along those lines? Probably not, right? We're getting information from parents, caregivers, school, friends, like, hey, it's not nice to hit other people because you wouldn't like to be hit. Like, oh, I guess that makes sense because when I get hit, I get upset by that. So, there's stuff that makes sense to people. I think that we're wired to pick up, but some of the complexity of this stuff is probably largely influenced by who we have around, so the types of things we're exposed to and some of that. So, again, the basis of moral development, not something you need to worry about, but do make sure that you're going through and understanding kind of Kohlberg's methodology and some of those higher order stages of moral development that we talked about: pre-conventional morality, conventional, and post-conventional. So that is questions that we got from online. Anything else that you all would like me to work through or provide clarification on, anything like that?
Go over the essential concepts and genetic variation, those three concepts that you talked about.
So one more time.
The three concepts that you talked about in like the human genetics slide about genetic variation.
So the genetic influence, the shared influence, and the environmental influence.
No, it was like here, sorry. Like the comprehension check too, like the streets of the image.
Oh, complex. Okay, yeah. So thinking about, and this is super important. One of these things as part of the class, I want you to walk away with, right? Okay, essential concepts, yeah. So when we're thinking about genetic influences on stuff, right? We know that genetics do have a heavy influence on, and the book does a nice job, excuse me, of talking about how genetics kind of set the parameters for certain capabilities. Okay. I played sports in high school. By the time I got to be my like senior year, I was fine, right? And if I really would have thrown myself into training and things like that, I could probably be okay. But I'm never going to be a professional athlete. Never ever. Doesn't matter how hard I work, right? Because my genetics put a ceiling on that, right? Same thing, right? I do find in school, I'm a professor, things along those lines, right? And like I could practice sort of piano sort of over and over, but I'm never going to be Mozart, right? There's some stuff that you kind of have to be sort of born with in order to achieve some of those levels. Not to say that we can't be excellent and amazing. I could sort of potentially be an amazing musician, right? But I'm not going to get there because I've got some parameters around that, right? And so recognizing sort of the genes and genetics do impact kind of our behaviors, but it's not the end all be all, right? Same thing, I might genetically be sort of more prone towards kind of introversion, sort of like type of things like that. I can work through that. I can sort of go out and sort of be sort of very outgoing and gregarious and things along those lines, but it's going to be more difficult for me than someone who's just kind of naturally this way. You know what I mean? So when we're thinking about sort of genes, the thing that I don't want people coming back, oh, like just like we're all hardwired and like sort of my destiny is set, right? What we know is that when we go through and take a look, these are complex behaviors that we are often interested in, things like personality, psychopathology, so learning, sort of things along these lines. It's determined by multiple genes, right? There is no alcohol gene, there is no personality gene, there is no narcissism gene. That's not what it is, right? It's a number of different genes that may be involved when we go through and we take a look at research that says, yeah, people who tend to show these traits tend to have these types of expressions. But it's not just one gene, it's a combination. So there's not one gene that switches that turns you into a narcissist or not, right? So wanting people to have appreciation of the complexity of some of the genetic influences. Yeah.
Would polygenic scores run into that at all?
What's that?
Polygenic scores, would that run into that at all?
Yeah. And that's exactly in the book when we're talking about polygenic stuff is like there are multiple genes coming together and sort of working in this picture. Same sort of thing when we were talking about like last section, we was talking about areas of the brain, right? There are areas of the brain and structures of the brain that are involved in things, but not structures of the brain that just uniquely sort of and only do like or account for everything, right? So like your hippocampus is important for memory. If you didn't have a hippocampus, you couldn't store memories, right? But it's not like all your memories, everything that makes you you is like just like hanging out little neural bundles in your hippocampus. Memory is sort of spread out, sort of networked out throughout, right? And so the same thing with genetics here. Other thing that we're thinking about, coding for a specific trait is not evidence for the purpose of that thing, right? So I may have genes that are involved in the presentation of, let's say, schizophrenia, right? Or bipolar or something like that. Probably on an evolutionary standpoint, like I don't have like a bipolar gene that was just like developed so that I get bipolar sometimes, right? Probably what happens is that gene is coding for many different things, right? Or the gene is involved in a lot of different stuff. And just the way it happens in combination with certain types of things, this can then contribute to the presentation of schizophrenia, right? Same thing with sort of genetic risk for heart disease, right? You probably don't have like a kill switch on there that's specifically just so you have heart disease at some point in time. That wouldn't make any sense, right? That gene probably sort of does a lot of other different things, but then just in combination with other circumstances, environmental factors, it then goes through contributors. So anytime again you hear like, oh, we found the alcohol gene or the intelligence gene or something like that, again, it's overly simplistic and misguided because it's not a gene for that. It may be a gene that's involved in it, but it's not something that's developed specifically for that sort of purpose. Okay. Same thing here at the end, thinking about genes being activated or inactivated by environmental factors. This gets into that epigenetics idea, right? Like we have genes that switch on and off, they code for something or they don't, right? But whether those are genes are expressed or not, we now are understanding can be impacted by environmental factors, things like diet, stress, different types of experiences, health-related issues, things along those lines that will then go through and activate and turn on or off these different types of things, right? This is why we can believe that we can have identical twins who are functionally genetic clones, where one person may have sort of eventually end up with a diagnosis of diabetes where someone else might not, right? Now, it doesn't matter even how poorly I eat or how little exercise I have, I'm probably not going to develop type 1 diabetes because that's a different thing. And so other types of problems, sure, right? If I'm going to do that, I have to have the genetic stuff going on in the right combination, and then probably some environmental factors that we don't completely understand, then cause the chain reaction and then sort of cause the presentation, right? So again, it's just not a full on, full off all the time. Different types of things that go through environmental factors that are interacting with that genetic structure to go through and produce different traits. Does that help kind of working through those? Awesome. Other stuff that would be helpful to walk through.
Can you go through like Kohlberg stages again?
Yeah. So what we'll do here is just, so in the lecture video I posted, we kind of went through kind of the individual stages, right? Again, that gets into some hair splitting that I don't need you to be responsible for. Again, just thinking about those higher order things or those higher order kind of categories. So remember that what was going on with Kohlberg's research is he was thinking about trying to apply these stage models to the development of moral reasoning. Okay. And what he did in sort of working through and looking at presenting the same ethical scenario to participants of different ages, right? Starting to see what he identified as a progression of so the sophistication of moral reasoning. Now, pre-conventional morality, okay, what we're seeing, and again, which I think is just really cool. Kohlberg wasn't interested in whether or not people thought Heinz should steal the drug or not, right? That didn't matter to him. What he was interested in, so the reasons people developed for their answer to this, right? In pre-conventional morality, what we're seeing are reasons that only consider Heinz and what happens to Heinz, right? There's no one else in the world in terms of these justifications outside of what happens to Heinz, right? So we get things like, well, he would get punished, or Heinz asked, right? Heinz did the right thing, right? What other people are doing doesn't matter. That's not considered. It's only about what Heinz is doing, right? Well, it was okay. He asked, he couldn't because he could be put in jail. Like, we're not thinking about the consequences of theft to other people, implications for society, things along those lines. Pre-conventional morality is just focused on what's happening to the target, right? And so it's a very, very basic, rudimentary sort of ideas. Sort of rules are obeyed to avoid punishment gain, right? Not because they're the right thing to do or because it benefits society. It's because if I do this, I'll get something. If I don't, I'll get punished, right? And so again, you think about this in small children, right? Like sort of this idea of why don't I take things from my friends? Maybe it's not because, that kid will feel sad or it's wrong or it's against sort of my faith or it's a sin or like it's just like, if I do it, I'll get punished and that's not good for me. So I'm not going to do it. Right. Or why am I helping this person in my class? Well, it's not because like, altruism, things along those lines. If I do this, I know I get a gold sticker. So I'm just going to do it. Right. That's kind of this idea at the pre-conventional morality. Okay. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Okay. When we get to conventional morality, what we see is an expansion of kind of the justification to start to consider other people in society. Okay. And kind of the low level of this is seeing things that correspond to this good boy, nice girl types of principle. Like, well, people like people who are nice. And so that's why you do nice things, because if you do nice things, other people like you, right? It's a little bit higher up because we're now thinking about sort of the impacts on other people or other people's perspectives. But it's still sort of pretty rudimentary stuff. Here, sort of as we start to get a little bit more sophisticated, thinking about the impacts of like, well, can't have everybody stealing just because they think they ought to, so he can't do that. Or, yeah, he can, but there are going to be consequences because we have to have rules and systems in place and things along those lines, right? So not considering sort of the sort of fundamental ethical sort of principles about this, it's still kind of rule driven, but we're starting to expand out and think about not just Heinz the person, but sort of impacts on society, what other people think about us, things along those lines. And finally, when we get to post-conventional morality, this is where we start to see reasoning starts to be sort of draw in, sort of going above and beyond just society, what other people will think about you, and starting to think about sort of higher order ethical principles, sort of just basic, like kind of the highest level of sort of morality, sort of types of consideration and things like that, right? So here at sort of social contract stuff, think about, well, certainly we need to have rules, but sort of there are things that need to be considered, right? Like how do we go through, how do we weigh out the rights of the scientists versus sort of the risk for or the benefits for this person and their family. When we get into ethical, universal ethical principles, this is sort of taking a stance that says Human life always supersedes. It doesn't matter how expensive. So if we can save one life, the cost doesn't matter because the human life outweighs sort of dollars and cents types of things, right? Or like we all have sort of an innate right to sort of agency and free will, and so if it doesn't matter if you think the pharmacist is right or not, he still has sort of an inherent right to sort of property and things along those lines. And so, you know, it was wrong for Heinz to steal it, right? So kind of leveling up there. So those are the kind of the level of stuff like that. That is, don't worry about sort of individual stages, just the three there, and kind of understanding the basic bones of that.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Other stuff.
Is it back to the genetics thing again?
Yeah.
In the comprehension check, you have a question that's what's an allele and by what mechanism does it impact traits and behaviors?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could kind of like
Yep.
answer that, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So the question is, what is an allele and by what mechanism does it impact traits and behavior? Okay. So allele, remember, allele is just a version of a gene, right? So we have like a gene, which is a segment of your strand of DNA. The allele is just sort of different versions of that, right? And so we have dominant alleles, recessive alleles. So the DNA genetic information that you get from your mother kind of come together. Talk about sort of basic Mendelian genetics, sort of on a very cursory level there. But essentially, what these alleles are doing, sort of these genes, are coding for some protein, right? And in sort of a complex physiological process, which I don't understand because this is not my area, what it's doing is it's coding for certain proteins that then produce physiological characteristics or sort of processes that then sort of then go in combination with lots of other things go through and provide some type of thing, right? And if it's a phenotype, it's sort of kind of what we go through and see, right? So thinking about eye color is not determined by one single gene, right? Determined by multiple genes, but to the combination of those alleles, and with like blue eyes are recessive, I think, as you go through sort of the combination of the proteins coded by those produce what we see as blue eyes, right? Remember, the only actual like single gene influence that I've been able to track down is to the earwax example, right? The difference between yellow sticky earwax and dry gray earwax looks like it is like one single gene, which is kind of gross, but you have one thing where it turns on and off is producing specific proteins that then sort of impact sort of what we're seeing at the observable trait level of sort of earwax, right? So that's all you need to worry about with that. Other stuff. Uncomfortable. Well, if you go through or run anything else that you're sort of as you're going through prep, if you have questions about, just shoot me an email. Firing off announcements sort of way later than probably is reasonable, but if you run into anything, shoot me an email. I'll do my very best to get you a response either tonight or tomorrow before the exam, so you can go through and take a look at it. So awesome. All right, thanks everybody for showing up. This was super helpful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.